Welcome to the Femsplainers. I'm Danielle Crittenden, and welcome to our season finale just before we break for the summer. Our guest this episode is Dr. Carole Hooven. She's an evolutionary biologist at Harvard, and she's just published truly one of the most remarkable and fascinating books I've come across in a long, long time. It's called T, The Story of Testosterone, the Hormone That Dominates and Divides Us. Now, Carole is that rare scientist who is able to take sometimes complicated and technical information and make it all understandable. And not just understandable, but weave it in with history, evolution, studies on everything from chimps to red deer to songbirds and, of course, humans, as well as her own experiences as a researcher. The result is a book that definitively shows how much the sexes are shaped by biology, nature, as it were, and much less by nurture. She reveals what a huge role testosterone plays in the differences between men and women. But as she points out, these conclusions don't have to reinforce stifling gender norms or so-called patriarchal values. Carole writes, quote, "Understanding the science sheds light on how we work and relate to one another, how we express anger and love, and how we can fight bias and problematic behavior to build a more fair society. In short, we've come a long way, baby, from chimps." But first, some exciting podcast news. The Femsplainers is moving to a new network, Podcast One, which will offer us a chance to reach more listeners across a bigger platform. So I'm really thrilled about that. And during July and August, I'll be working with their team to improve and refine the podcast. So I'd love to hear from you, our listeners, as to what you like best about the Femsplainers, what you'd like to hear more of, or maybe less of. I always love hearing your comments, suggestions, and guest ideas. We read everything sent to us. And if you have thoughts, reach out to us via email, contact@femsplainers.com. That's again, contact@femsplainers.com. Even at Podcast One, though, we'll still very much rely on our listeners' support. Last week, we had a great monthly virtual cocktail party with some of our subscribers at patreon.com/femsplainers. They joined us from as far away as Regina, Saskatchewan, and South Korea. It's a fun, lively community. I love chatting with everyone about everything. And best of all, no one gets canceled. That's one of the benefits of being a subscriber at Patreon. But you'll also get our monthly newsletter, our monthly bonus episode where you get to ask our guests the questions. And we had great questions for Carole for this episode. And you'll also, at certain levels, get the podcast ad-free. And of course, everybody gets invited to the party. So again, consider supporting the podcast at patreon.com/femsplainers. And as a member, we'll stay in touch with you and get together even while we're on break for the summer. Now, because this podcast is the last of the season, I'll take time after my interview with Carole to read listener reaction. As always, you have some wonderful comments, observations, and anecdotes. And wow, did you have a lot to say about that interview with Nancy Jo Sales? So thanks. And now I'll bring on Carole Hooven to talk about her book. Again, it's called T, The Story of Testosterone, the Hormone That Dominates and Divides Us. Carole, welcome to the Femsplainers.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so thrilled to have you. This is probably one of the most explosive books, scientific books written, recently, and it shouldn't be, but it is. And I want to talk with you about that. But as you note, the science is clear. Testosterone. Can I just call it T?
Sure.
And we won't confuse it with tea and coffee. Tea is a major invisible player in our relationships, sex lives, athletic abilities, childhood play, gender transitions, parenting roles, violent crime, and so much more. But there is still a lot of pushback to the idea that it does, in fact, cause sex difference and significantly influences behavior. So let's start. Why is there that pushback? And did it part of your inspiration to write this book?
That pretty much was the inspiration to write the book. Initially, I wanted to just write about hormones because there were a couple, I'll call them dominant males in my department who are great guys who are colleagues of mine, but have, like the chair of the department, et cetera, were encouraging me to write a book because they had written books and they were successful. And I teach a course that's, pretty popular, and it's about how the hidden ways that hormones shape our behavior. So I submitted a proposal based on that to my agent at first, and that went nowhere. I had no idea what I was doing in terms of how to write a book proposal, et cetera. So that didn't go anywhere. And then a year passed, and I found myself complaining a lot, coming home and complaining to my husband in particular, who happens to be a philosopher, about how the science was changing. So what is passing as science now was very different from science that had been done previously. And there seemed to be a social agenda that was stated explicitly in some of these scientific papers that seemed to be shaping the kinds of studies that were being done and the conclusions that were being drawn. And I was getting a little bit of pushback from my students about using terms like male and female and misgendering subjects of scientific studies, where I have to say this person is male and here's how testosterone, or this person is female and here's how the hormones affect these people as male or female. But there was sort of a series of events and a trend that I sensed that just seemed to intensify. So there were books and papers and articles coming out through the popular press that I felt like are misleading people, misleading the public about reality. And as a person who loves science changed my life personally and professionally. And I am a stickler for the truth. And I felt like people are just getting really confused about reality because the science is getting interwoven with social agendas, and it's difficult to figure out what's what anymore. So when I submitted my second proposal, I said that I want to write about this hormone and how understanding this hormone helps us understand human beings, our culture, our sex differences, like you said, our relationships, all of that. And that one hit. And things have only intensified since I submitted that proposal a couple of years ago. Things are, I hope, reaching some sort of peak. And hopefully things will get back to where we can just count on the science and there won't be so much bias in science itself, unfortunately, and via journalism and books that are coming out, et cetera.
Right. I want to get to the transgenderism and the hormonal experimentation there in a bit, but I have found it strange that a person can hold these two ideas in their head. I don't mean just transgendered people, the activists and such that you're talking about, that it's all nurture, male, female, completely contrived identities, and you can be any identity. But if you want to become a man and you take testosterone, I can never pronounce it. You take T, suddenly, not only do you get hair on your face, your muscles grow, your voice lowers, you get an Adam's apple, but your sexual drive changes. And you have written about this. So it's quite strange. The progressive view is A, there is no gender is fluid, but B, in order to be one gender, you take this hormone and everything radically changes.
Right. So, I mean, that's a good example of how trying to twist science to suit a certain social agenda can just cause massive amounts of confusion. And I also think that doing so disrespects people. It disrespects their ability to handle the truth. Because the truth, I do think ultimately, in some sense, will set us free. Feeding people misinformation to try to push a social agenda, or making people, telling them what you think they need to hear to feel better about themselves, or to legitimize somehow their identity. I don't think that's doing anybody any favors. But the flip side of that is, yes, we do have a tremendous amount of information about what happens when I'll just say natal male, like a male-bodied person, blocks their testosterone and takes estrogen, or if a natal female takes testosterone and the ways in which she changes do in some ways conform to the stereotypes that we have about sex differences in the first place. So it's clear that biology is incredibly important to what we think of as masculinity and femininity and how that plays out in society. Obviously, hormones and genes have a lot to do with that.
Right. And I want to stress to our listeners, by the way, that your book is very thick. So everything that you're saying that we are truncating on this episode, you just have massive amounts of studies, but as I said up top, so entertainingly told, and, chimps and songbirds. But let's go right back to the womb, because one of the things you wanted to determine was, okay, yes, men and women have these different hormone levels, but it may produce some traits, but it shouldn't change the way we think or how we feel, or that, women are going to be less good at math than men. But you wanted to find out, let's go right back into the womb and see what it does and where it starts. So.
Right. So I think you're asking about how hormones affect the brain and ultimately the way that we behave, the interests that we have, who we become as adults, what patterns of masculinity and femininity. Mm-hmm. And I just want to say at the outset that culture plays a huge role there. And there's a tremendous amount of overlap between the sexes on almost all of these traits, right? So there's some boys and men who are super peaceful and emotional and loving and only want one sexual partner for their whole lives. And there are some women, and I think some of these women, who want a high number of sexual partners and have no problem with that, and who are, physically aggressive and maybe not so emotional, right? So we know that there's a huge amount of variation. So pretty much everything I say, just tack on average afterwards, so that I don't have to say it every time. But there is a tremendous amount of overlap. But we know from particularly studies in non-human animals, from observing what happens naturally, but also from experiments in non-human animals where testosterone or particular genes have been manipulated, that when you change testosterone in the, I'm going to say, perinatal environment, and that is what occurs during pregnancy to the fetus or shortly after pregnancy. So male fetuses have testes that produce high levels of testosterone, and female fetuses have ovaries that do not produce really any hormones that have meaningful effects in the body as far as we know. So if you have an absence of testosterone in a female, you will get female reproductive structures. And what I'm just going to say is a female brain. I'm not saying that there are, male brains are always like this or female brains are always like that. But we do know that testosterone exposure, if you're pregnant with a little boy, his little testes are producing high levels of testosterone that are basically helping him grow a penis and his internal reproductive structures. But it's also getting into his brain and shaping the way the neurons are developing, populations of neurons, different kinds of structures. So we know that for a fact in non-human animals, and we know that when testosterone is high, you're going to get a juvenile male that likes rough and tumble play in a way that the female doesn't, in non-humans and in humans. So in humans, we can't do these experiments, but we do have evidence from natural conditions in which females produce higher than average levels of testosterone. And one of those conditions is called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where the adrenal gland, because of a genetic mutation, produces relatively high levels for a female of androgens, testosterone being the most important one. So these girls are masculinized on average. And as little kids, they like higher levels of rough and tumble play, like tackling their friends and having a more of a physical component to their play. And that's a large sex difference, where little boys are much more likely to want to play physically compared to girls. And again, on average. And we know that that has something to do with perinatal exposure to testosterone, which again is much, much higher in boys and seems to have meaningful effects, even in childhood, that seem to be promoted by these higher levels of androgens in utero.
I liked how you have this description that up until I think the 9th week, that that the sex could go either way. It's like there's a fork in the road, and then the testosterone kicks in, and it becomes a boy.
Well, it's just a little bit before that. Even we males and females have gonads that are undifferentiated. They're basically identical until 6 weeks. And it's the presence of the Y chromosome and the SRY gene, which is on the Y chromosome, the sex determining region of the Y chromosome, that causes that undifferentiated gonad to become testes. So it could become ovaries if that Y chromosome doesn't have the SRY gene, or if there is no Y chromosome. So that's sort of amazing that we come with these structures that can go either way. So being male or being female is really about whether you are going to be producing basically small mobile gametes or large immobile gametes, sperm or eggs. But then from there on, if there are testes, there's going to be almost always testosterone produced. And then testosterone is what develops those reproductive structures that aren't the gonads, like the penis or the vas deferens or the prostate. But then, of course, in puberty, testosterone is what accounts for the secondary sex characteristics like muscles and strong bones and taller height, et cetera.
Yeah, I loved that you even had an illustration showing that the male sex organs are like inside out female.
In a way,
or maybe it's the other way around. No, it would be the male organs.
Female organ. So it really is true that the female form reproductively is basically the default. This is a controversial thing to say with some feminists who don't kind of push back on the idea that to get a female phenotype is kind of a passive process, but it is relative to what it takes to produce male reproductive structures. A whole bunch of things have to go right with testosterone. It doesn't mean that, of course, there are genes involved in creating female structures, but if you don't develop them with testosterone, you end up with almost what looks very similar to what you have very early on. Right. So you have a lot more things have to go right to produce, to grow a penis from a smaller structure.
They're like mirror inside out reflections of each other. All right. So let's go into some of these differences. So as you say, it makes men taller, stronger. But you have many studies, of course, showing boys and girls playing differently, and they're trying to control for every factor. And many will just argue that these behaviors are a product of nurture, because even as babies, as you point out, we'll treat a girl baby slightly differently than a boy baby. We'll toss the boy baby around and, cuddle and soothe the female baby.
Yeah, that's true.
So you had to sort of tackle that, because that's a good point. Okay, so you come out with some of these biological differences, but maybe just society kicks in so quickly and starts to feminize and masculinize.
Yeah, society does kick in very quickly. Social norms kick in very quickly. People do respond to people based on their sex and treat them differently. However, there's really no good evidence that I'm aware of that differential treatment can help explain these very robust and cross-culturally consistent with non-human animals who don't have human culture, that these different patterns of interaction contribute to the emergence of these different patterns of behavior. So it's not enough just to point out that, say, in some experiment or even in real life, I will be a little bit rougher with a boy baby than a girl baby, or I'll give trucks to a boy and dolls to a girl. Just pointing that out it's just not enough to explain these robust differences that have so much other evidence behind them, that there's a large contribution of genes, and particularly differences in sex hormones. There are plenty of little boys who take boys who are going to grow up to be gay. As kids, they are more likely to reject typical masculine interests and rough and tumble play and playing with trucks. They're more likely to want to play with girls and do the kinds of things that girls do. And that's not because they're being treated in some feminine way. It's because they are who they are. They have the nature that they have. What we do as parents just unfortunately doesn't, maybe as a parent, have the pronounced effect that we might hope. People grow into who they're going to be. The evidence is pretty strong about that. Peer influences are important. But again, I haven't come across any research showing that differential treatment is a potent force in shaping sex differences in these kinds of behaviors.
Well, just as a slight digression or aside, our first child was a daughter. Of course, your first child, you think everything you do is critical and crucial. Right. And so I was very determined, she wore little overalls and she had very gender non-specific toys and things. And then when she was old enough to go to the playground after about a year, she started aggressively snatching baby dolls from other little girls.
Because you deprived her of the opportunity.
Grabbing them in their strollers and forcing little bottles on them. And I realized, okay, I got to get you a baby doll.
Well, that reminds me of these stories of parents who try to do the reverse thing for their little boys. Right. And they find them, picking up dolls and shooting bullets out of their head.
Barbies.
It's pretty much the same pattern there.
Right. So we all know, we've all seen that if you've been a parent. But let's talk about the evolutionary strategy for these differences. That why men are more aggressive, why they're stronger, why women are, as you prove, naturally more empathetic, more suited to caregiving. Not in every species, but in most, and certainly in every human culture.
Right. So these sex differences are pronounced. And I just want to be careful about saying something like women are more suited for X or Y, because, that can kind of give the idea that women are supposed to do one thing or the other, which I don't, if you're somebody who doesn't want to have kids and you don't ever want to nurture kids, great. So again, it's just a matter of saying on average, but you're right. There is evidence that in every culture studied, women have more fear behaviors. They have express more vulnerable emotions like crying. They appear to be more empathetic. And there's some evidence, as far as it can be measured in non-human animals, that female animals actually show across some different kinds of species what seems to be something like empathy at higher rates than males. And so the evolutionary strategy is pretty simple. And that's that there is because females, if they want to have offspring, need to use their bodies to grow and feed those offspring. So if you've had a kid, it is this bizarre realization that fetus is feeding off of your body. It's inside of you. It's intense.
It's very shocking.
It's like, you can't understand it really until you have one inside of you, restricting your life in a pronounced way, right? And we have controlled fertility. We can take birth control and regulate how many babies we have, ideally, how many times we're pregnant. And then there's lactation, right? So before there was such a thing in our ancestral environment, say before there was birth control, women were having lots of babies during their reproductive careers. They were pumping them out every few years and needed a lot of energy. It had to have a lot of resources to be able to store energy that could be drawn on during pregnancy and lactation to grow and feed their offspring. So they have to accumulate fat, right? So estrogen biases energy that's coming in to be deposited as fat. Sex hormones help us convert energy into offspring. That's the goal of life from an evolutionary point of view. Males have testosterone to convert energy into offspring, but it's fascinating to think that what it's doing is giving them an increased body size and more muscle. Is that so they can produce a baby? No. It's so that they can compete with other males for the right to produce a baby. So we see this across, again, many different species. Testosterone does so many different things in male animals, like grow big, sharp antlers so that red deer can compete for a harem of females and use those sharp antlers to try to poke out the eyes of a competitor male. It helps them grow to a larger body size, have increased muscle mass, because that's their reproductive strategy. So in humans, those sex differences aren't quite as pronounced because we're so unusual among mammals in that our males invest in the offspring. That's highly unusual. It's about 95% of mammals. The males have no further investment after contributing the sperm. So testosterone gives them much larger body size so that they can compete sometimes ferociously and physically for mates. But in humans, because men can benefit reproductively, not always, but from investing in their offspring and forming pair bonds, their testosterone does not have to be maybe as large of a sex difference. They don't need the same amount of muscle mass difference from the female. They don't need to be quite so physically aggressive because the competition is a little bit softer in humans. They need to be nurturing too. They need to be able to care for their spouse or their mate and their offspring. And that requires different kinds of traits. So we don't see this huge difference in male-male competition and female competition. Females compete also for mates because we want to compete for high-status mates sometimes who have the resources. So overall, the evolutionary strategy is that where we do see differences, it is because there is some reproductive advantage for males to compete for mates, sometimes aggressively, but most often in modern society, not aggressively, just it's more to compete for resources that will allow males to attract mates. But we don't see the intense level of competition. We don't see quite that sex difference in physical size, but there is an advantage to males to being larger and stronger and being able to compete for mates because they benefit reproductively from increasing number of mates in a way that females do not. We benefit from being, on average, healthy, living a long life, and having more body fat. So sorry, that was a very long answer.
That's the downside of the female, more body fat.
But let's not think of it as a debt. Now we can think of it as like, hey, this is what nature gave me to have, help me have babies. Even if you don't have babies, it's still, advantageous in a lot of ways.
One of and also the T levels are not static. That was another interesting thing necessarily. I was actually reading your book. I have a porch where this family of, I think they're wrens or sparrows has.
We have some wrens too that are nesting.
They're really messy. They're lousy. And
you see the mom and dad back and forth, right? And working together.
Yes, they go back and forth. And I was literally reading your book section about songbirds and how after the very noisy mating season, the dad, his T levels go down, correct? Because now he's mated and he's got to provide. And so you watch him bringing food back and forth. And then you had so his T levels go down. And then they had an experiment where they were injecting testosterone in this post-mating phase. And the dads, they became like Homer Simpson. Like they started to go to the bar, spend the milk money. And the kids were all starving because dad got distracted and didn't come home. And I think we've seen this happen in men who become primary caregivers of children also apparently have lower levels of testosterone.
That's right.
At that point. So talk a little bit about
I'm so glad you brought that up, and I'm my hair is literally standing on end just knowing that you had the experience that I have, that so many people do have when you just watch birds and what they're doing, and that it's incredible to see, especially a male who's just working so hard all day long to go out and get the food and come back and feed his kids over and over and over again. You're like, where is he getting that worm? Where is he getting that spider? He was just here like 2 minutes ago with a huge honking spider, and now he has another one. And the females also working hard. They're working as a team to raise their kids, and then they're going to fledge. And, so it's really remarkable. And we do see similar testosterone patterns in humans because our males invest in kind of a similar way. You can get away with being a single mom in humans, but you can't in birds and in monogamous birds where the chicks require investment from both parents. And what you said is exactly right. And I'm so glad that that science came through in my book. So the male, in order to nurture his kids in that way, his testosterone must be suppressed. And it is the stimuli of those chicks that causes his testosterone to go down, just like in humans men who are interacting with their babies, that will cause their testosterone to drop somewhat. If they don't interact with their kids, you tend not to see that effect. But you're right, in the birds, if you jack up their testosterone level when they're supposed to be nurturing their kids, they go, right, like Homer Simpson, that's great. They go out and they're like singing at the border of their territory, trying to pick fights and attract new mates, and their kids die. It's a terrible reproductive strategy, right? So I love that you brought up that point that high testosterone is not always good for male reproduction. It's variable, and it depends on the environment. It depends on the social system. And like if a foreign male intrudes on one of those, this was research done in song sparrows and also red-winged blackbirds. If a foreign male intrudes on a male's territory, even when his testosterone is low, because it's adaptive for him to keep it low a lot of the time, that's when it will go up. So it's something happening socially that triggers the testosterone rise in the male that facilitates aggression when necessary. Otherwise, it's going to stay low if possible, because having high testosterone has costs that aren't good for survival and reproduction.
Just as another quick aside, at one point I saw the dad bring back this little sheet of plastic, like a wrapper or something, and it was like he'd been to the Home Depot. There's a leak in the nest. Excuse me,
did the mom or something toss that out?
I don't know why.
Oh, that's so funny.
Anyway, well, let's talk about violence and female aggression. So we know how you've talked about how it manifests itself in men and male birds, but women are obviously capable of violence. They're capable, as you wrote about, of domestic abuse, which often goes underreported. But how does their aggression and violence differ from male?
That's such a good question, and I'm glad you brought it up. So there really aren't big sex differences some people say that there are, but I don't interpret the literature this way. I don't see sex differences in overall competitiveness or aggression. There are sex differences in physical aggression and the kind of aggression that puts the person who's engaged in the aggression at physical risk. Women do that far less than men. That's obvious. Men commit 95% of murders, worldwide, right? So at the extremes, there are very large sex differences, especially in the most severe damaging forms of physical aggression. However, we also know, especially with social media, we're getting a great view into this, the way that females can be aggressive and can compete, which sometimes result in severe damage to their victims. But a lot of the time it's not physical. There are cases, though, that we know of where girls have committed suicide because of the intense abuse that they're getting through social media from other girls. So girls can be quite vicious. Women can be quite vicious. But the way that they're competing and the way that they're being aggressive is passive. It doesn't put themselves physically at risk to the same extent that males put themselves at risk. Like they will just beat the crap out of each other and then resolve a conflict, say. Mm-hmm. That's like perfectly normal among men. It is not normal among women. So women can also be, as you mentioned, physically aggressive, especially in domestic situations. Most often when, in some cases, pushing and shoving and hitting and sometimes using knives or something even more damaging. And sometimes the males are not fighting. Sometimes men are not fighting back, but most often this occurs in a situation where females are victims of male aggression, male abuse psychologically or physically, and they're retaliating. But they're certainly capable of physical aggression. But overall, males are responsible for much more of that domestic abuse related physical aggression in those intimate situations. But it's true that females can also be the aggressors, but they tend to do less physical damage overall to their partners. And this is underreported, that the rates of physical aggression in those domestic situations in many cultures are roughly even. And that's the rates. That is not the severity. Males are responsible for the overwhelming majority of murders and severe physical assaults. So that's just something to be appreciated. I think that almost all of the conversation is about female victims, and that is understandable, right? Because they're much more likely to suffer severe assaults. But there also needs to be attention paid to men who are victims. I think that's important to be understood.
Well, also I remember this, and any girl who's been through high school remembers this, that I used to envy boys who, when they would settle it over a fight in the schoolyard, as bad as that was, the weeks of psychological torture, of bullying, of mean girl behavior, I just thought was so far worse to have to endure. So,
right.
Okay, let's move on to sports. This is hugely controversial right now, of course, as we come up to the Olympics. We now have transgendered athletes wanting to compete in transgendered women wanting to compete in women's sports.
And now we have one who will be competing.
Right, in New Zealand. We have in
weightlifting.
And a hurdler was just rejected for having, they've tried to set, I guess, testosterone levels at a certain cap for a certain amount of time. But let's just go to the base fact about physical female differences as it applies to sports. And you had a couple points. You write that women's world records are consistently about 10% lower than those of men. You wrote, in 2019, 2,500 men competing worldwide for the 100-meter event beat the fastest women's times.
Yeah.
And you wrote, without segregating sports, it's not just that men would win, women would never even qualify for the competition.
Yeah, on average. I mean, and it depends, of course, at what level you're talking about. Yeah.
So let's talk about why there are those differences.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people are not surprised to learn that testosterone in puberty, male levels of testosterone are clearly responsible for that increased height, increased bone strength, bone density, longer bones. That's why males tend to be taller. Increased hemoglobin, which gives males much more power, so that they can use to fuel those larger muscles during sports. And so the combination of significantly higher strength and muscle mass, 30 to 40% more than females, or even more in the upper body, is a huge benefit to men in sports. Like, there's just no question that the going through male puberty gives men an extremely large advantage. It can be 10 to 50%, depending on the sport. So, in certain running events, it might be 10%, but in weightlifting, it could be 30%. There's a massive difference in muscle and power and height and grip strength and bone strength and hemoglobin. And all of this contributes to the male advantage over females in different sports. So on average, if you're, a highly trained athlete, those are going to be consistent advantages. So the question that comes up with trans women in particular, so trans men seem not to be an issue. Trans men can compete against men, but tend not to have any kind of advantages, which is not surprising. They're smaller and don't have the same amount of muscle mass, even if they're taking testosterone. So when we're talking about trans women, we're talking, just to be clear, about people who are natal males. And in the case, say, with Laurel Hubbard, somebody who experienced a male puberty, so was able to accrue these advantages of increased muscle mass and body size and strength. The argument, I think, from her point of view is that, well, as a trans woman, she has to reduce her testosterone. And so people might think, as some are trying to advocate for this position, which is just not supported by evidence, which is, well, if she reduces her testosterone, it happens to be to 10 nanomoles per liter, which is still far above the normal female range. But in any event, even if she were to block it entirely for a year, she would still not lose all of those advantages that she gained from going through a male puberty. So the one thing that does go down to typical female levels is the hemoglobin. But almost everything else is retained. The bone strength is retained. Muscle mass drops, but it doesn't drop anywhere near to the typical female level. It drops about 5 to 10% on average. And actually, a study just came out, which was a review of 13 studies looking at this issue. And they said that muscle mass and strength drops about 5% after a year of sex hormone therapy, that is blocking testosterone in a natal male. So the evidence is clear that there are these physical traits that are retained in trans women that would, on average, give them a physical advantage in sports. My view is that doesn't necessarily decide the issue. It just means that's what the science says. And then we have to figure out what to do. So I don't want to tell anybody what to do. I don't even want to have an opinion about that, because I think that science is best done without a strong social or political agenda. And here, I just don't even want to get involved in that. So I don't have a real strong opinion there. I do have a strong opinion about the science. Trans women on average have an advantage over natal women. And it's a complex and difficult and sensitive question. And I understand, I think, the perspective, especially in high school, of trans girls and families of trans girls who just want to be able to compete as girls. So it's very complicated, the ethical and social and political aspects of that question. The science is not. It's pretty straightforward. The evidence is clear as far as I can tell.
Right. And you point out, in past civilizations, we've had experiments with what we used to call castration, and especially amongst choir boys, to keep their lovely angelic high voices. They would castrate them, which also, again, points out the importance of testosterone to your development.
That's right.
So they would not develop. If you were to do this to an athlete at 12 or 13, do you think it would still be possible?
Well, that's a great question. And that's going to be coming up, because more and more kids are taking puberty blockers.
Right.
So say you could have a natal male who does not go through a natal typical male puberty, but instead blocks testosterone and goes through an estrogenic puberty, or something like a female puberty. And there you have an interesting question about whether there would be any significant advantage for that individual as a trans woman to compete against natal women. There is some evidence that even prior to puberty, boys have a small advantage over girls in some sports. It seems to be less than 5%. It's not consistent, but there is something there that seems to be different. And there's also sex differences, of course, in the brain and how testosterone acts in the brain. Some have argued that that should be important, because you'll have a difference in drive or competitiveness in people who've had that testosterone exposure. That's a different kind of argument, but I think that's a good question. And it's one that we are going to need to work out.
I realize I skipped over one question that I wanted to ask you when we were talking about sexual differences in behavior and desire. It is just like such a common question that we all ask ourselves, that you point out that men do in fact have a higher libido, and they do have a much bigger desire or acceptance of sex without commitment, casual sex. They're happy with multiple partners. Do you want to explain that a little before?
Sure. I mean, those are robust findings, and it's consistent with our stereotypes about sex differences. But it's a fact that males do report having a higher libido, and their behavior to some degree supports that. This is consistent in the literature. It's consistent across cultures. They also express a desire for a higher number of sexual partners. That's not always a huge difference, but there is a difference there, that males on average want more sexual partners than women. The data are difficult, and some people push back, because there are some men who will say, I want, 1,000 sex partners. But one thing we can do is look at the differences between gay male culture and sexual culture and lesbian sexual culture. So here we have a little bit of a social experiment or something, you could say, to see how the sexual natures of males and females play out when they're unrestricted by the needs or limitations of the opposite sex. And I think we all know what those differences in sexual culture are, that on average, gay men are in fact having more sexual partners and more sex and seem to have higher libidos than lesbians, who, you know, the joke is that they're going to basically get into relationships on the first date. I don't want to say what the joke is, but
I'll do it for you. You have that hilarious Andrew Sullivan joke. Right. I'll probably mangle it, but it was like the differences between lesbians and gay men. After the first date, one of the lesbians gets a U-Haul.
What does a gay man bring on a second date?
Oh, right.
What second date? What does a lesbian bring on a second date? A U-Haul. So that's just a huge stereotype, right? But it is backed by actual evidence. And that's a way for us to understand our sexual natures. And of course, this gets complicated in heterosexual relationships because we have different sexual natures. Men can't just have all the partners that they want and all the sex that they want necessarily, because women have different kinds of desires on average. So that is true. And testosterone seems to play a role. And one way we know that is from the evidence from transgender people. So I interviewed some transgender people for the book, whose experiences do seem to be fairly representative of the experience of many, many transgender people who have participated in studies. And we have evidence from what their experience is in the scientific literature. So what seems very clear is that when you transition from female to male and you increase your testosterone to male levels, your mind is blown by how horny you are. And that is a pronounced effect. And people describe thinking, oh my God, this is what it's like to go through the world as a man. And the people who had, up until the point they transitioned, lived their lives as women are like, I am seeing life from the other side here. That's what they want, of course, if they're doing a hormonal transition, but it is a really mind expanding way to understand the opposite sex, that there is a much more pressing need for sex. And this is particularly evident in the first couple years of taking testosterone. It's like going through a male puberty. And we know that adolescent boys and young men, their libidos are pretty high. They're thinking about sex a lot. So our women who are going through that, their estrogenic puberty, estrogen also increases libido. But it seems to be of a different quality. And so we know that it does have something to do with testosterone, particularly from castration experiments, from the history of castration, where libido plummets if you don't have testosterone. And so we know that also when males block their testosterone to transition to living as a woman, their libido goes down. And that's just very clear that testosterone has these effects that can help us understand sex differences in sexuality. And there's also these differences in orgasm that seem to be an effect of testosterone. And I'm not sure if you want me to
Go on. No, for sure. Okay. Now you can't leave us tantalizingly
hanging on the
edge.
orgasm. Yeah. So I found this fascinating because I did not know this. I knew, of course, that men behave differently after they have an orgasm, after sex. They have different needs, right? That on average.
I once heard a therapist say men go to sleep and women want to start cleaning the house.
What? I would think it's women want to cuddle.
Well, maybe that's
yeah, that's so funny. But
the I'm done quality.
So what the people I interviewed, their experiences again were consistent with what I learned from consulting the scientific literature on the changes that happen in transgender people who are either taking testosterone or blocking testosterone. So female to male people who take testosterone report having a different experience of orgasm. And this is whether, so that's, let's just say you don't have any kind of genital or reproductive surgery, right? You keep your original equipment. So, for people, for trans men, the orgasm becomes more time limited, so shorter, but more intense at the peak and more focused on the genitalia. And that's a surprise for them, because when they were living as women, which is consistent with what happens to males who block their testosterone and take estrogen, their orgasms become longer, more full body, less intense at the peak, but sort of they describe it's more like their whole body is a sexual organ. And I had two people tell me that they enjoyed the orgasms off of testosterone, woohoo, more than those on, that full body experience is just more pleasurable and even more emotional in a way. So I found that fascinating. I think it helps to explain a lot, because for men, it's like, it's over. I'm going to go do something else right now. And women are kind of still luxuriating, in the afterglow. So,
yes. Well, my last question, because I could just endlessly talk to you about this, but one of the parts that I found just so impressive in your book was, especially at the beginning of your career as a scientist, that you came up against challenging ideas, upsetting ideas about what you were seeing, the scientific underpinnings of men and women. But then you came to the idea, and I'll just quote you. You said, let's get rid of the idea that the sexes must be born with basically the same brains in order to have equal rights. That usually seems to mean that women should be more like men. And so the question is, now, knowing that we have these differences, knowing that they're biologically underpinned, how do we then triumph over biology? How do we differentiate ourselves from chimps? How can our culture and socialization help with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in many ways, of course, we have triumphed over biology. We are actually incredibly peaceful. We're becoming, if you read Steve Pinker, we're becoming much more peaceful over time. Violence has declined, and it's not because our genes are changing. It's because our culture is changing. Even if you look cross-culturally, we can see that in some cultures, I talk in the book about, I just mentioned Singapore, where physical violence, rates of physical violence are incredibly low. It's a very, very safe country because mostly men are not acting out. So rape and murder, the rates are extremely low. That is because they promote that in their culture. They have very strict.
Very strict. Like, you can get arrested and imprisoned, I think, for chewing gum.
Yes. So strict laws and social norms that promote that behavior. Whether you agree with those laws and norms, it does prove that the environment has a huge impact on how we express our natures. So everywhere men are more physically violent than women, that never changes. But the rate of violence, or the size of sex difference, or the size of that sex difference, can change dramatically depending on where you live. It can change dramatically depending on your family, your town, whether you have a job or not. So many different factors about your environment. And we know that there are other countries where rape and murder are rampant and that are incredibly unsafe. And that is because of the culture. So in many ways, we have, in some senses, triumphed over, I guess, gained some, we can control our behavior is the point. There's tons of evidence to support that. But I think that what is most important is having open conversations about these problems, admitting that, yes, there is an issue with male aggression, especially at the extreme end of male aggression or sexual assault. It's a huge problem, but pretending that this is caused solely or even predominantly by cultural influences doesn't help to solve the problem. First of all, we're just going to eliminate the patriarchy. That's not easier than trying to understand our biology and how biology and culture interact. Like, that's what we need to understand. We don't want to put blinders on to the truth. That's not going to help us in terms of making social progress. So I'm just a passionate advocate of doing whatever we need to do to understand the truth, understanding how our genetics and hormones and evolved natures interact with our cultures to produce behavior, and the ways in which we can shape culture to help stem some of the more problematic aspects, particularly of male behavior, because that's has the most serious consequences.
Right. Well, I think ignoring our differences also means then ignoring our strengths. And I think women, especially feminists, get worried that the minute you start pointing out, oh, that women are more nurturing or whatever, as you say, oh, that means you have to do X or Y, or you can't do math, or you're going to be too emotional to be a leader. But there are real strengths to those traits too. And we've employed them symbiotically with male, traits. And the fact that we have, monogamy and involved dads, especially today, is a huge triumph.
Yes.
But if you're just going to hate on your traits or only see them as weak, like empathy is also a very powerful tool,
Oh, of course.
Especially in statecraft,
Yeah, no, you're right. And I'm glad you brought this up, because just because a trait has a genetic or hormonal or evolutionary basis, of course, it doesn't mean that that is going to restrict behavior, right? It influences behavior, but it doesn't restrict what we can do or who we can be, right? On average, yeah, it's going to have effects on sex differences, but it doesn't limit us, and it doesn't imply that any behavior should be validated because it might have a biological cause. What we're concerned with is the consequences of behavior, right? And dealing with the consequences. The cause doesn't determine how we should respond to a particular behavior or trait.
Right. Well, this is just a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much. And thank you for writing this book. I cannot recommend it enough. And it's so many more details than we were able to get into, not least if you're watching these red deer battle it out for domination and chimp behavior, and of course the birds. But I really, really loved it. So profound.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I hope you found that as fascinating as I did. And I really hope you go and get the book. It's just so interesting, and there's so much more in it. Again, the book is called T, The Story of Testosterone, the Hormone That Dominates and Divides Us. Okay, so we have a backlog of listener reaction going all the way back to May. As mentioned, we also got so many funny comments about that disastrous interview I had with Vanity Fair writer Nancy Jo Sales. I was heartened that 99.9% of you wrote in to say, in answer to my question, was I crazy or was she? It was emphatically she. Phew. So I've compiled a selection of excerpts, including some of your own experience with dating apps and advice for others using them. But let's start with Blair. Blair, this goes back to last summer or even longer. He sent in his photo. I know this is objectifying, Blair, but you're a very handsome young man. And we had this idea that we might start a dating app for femsplainer listeners. And of course, I have none of the technological know-how to do it. But in any case, he sent in an update, which sounds really, really interesting. He said, well, first of all, sorry, ladies, he's in a relationship with a great gal. But also, he writes, a few months ago, I started a blog, Equality for Boys and Men, which supports empathy and equality for boys and men, of course, with a focus on Washington State. I'm working on building a statewide platform for male advocacy. It's quite clear nowadays we need to be better looking after ways in which boys and men are struggling and experiencing negative effects of gender inequality. I'd welcome any tips or reactions you'd offer. I'm on YouTube and Instagram, in addition to producing content for the blog. So again, the name of the blog is Equality for Boys and Men. And if you have any trouble finding Blair or want to reach out to him, just write us at contact@femsplainers.com and we can forward your notes. Just don't overwhelm us with them. Okay. We had a couple comments on Abigail Tucker, who wrote that also wonderfully accessible science-based book called Mom Genes, just what happens to us as women when we get pregnant and become mothers. Rose reached out to us on Facebook. She said, I've listened to this episode twice and am just blown away by the stem cell findings. Love that I will forever carry a piece of my children within me, but wonder about a woman who chooses not to continue a pregnancy. Do those stem cells remain in her body? That's a great question, Rose. I can't answer it. We'd have to put that to Abigail. And then we have about Mom Genes from Magdalena. She said, super interesting episode. I'm from Germany and very often shocked about how little the American healthcare system seems to respect new mothers. I think we'll all agree to that. All right. On our two-part series on the phenomenon of all young boys wanting to transition to girls, it was kind of a companion series to the episode we did last summer with Abigail Schreier on this sudden rash of young girls seeking to transition to be boys. And to just stress, this is happening in adolescence or pre-adolescence. And our interest was among children who had shown no previous signs or inclination of gender dysmorphia. So Lori wrote in and said, thank you so much for addressing the gender non-binary / transgendered issues. You are brave and you are doing good work. So much to say, but for now, I'll just tell you that I work in multiple behavioral health facilities, and I am shocked by what I now see. We are all shocked, but no one is really comfortable talking about it for fear of backlash, being labeled as transphobic, and potentially losing our jobs. I'm also most terrified by the trans activists who promote literally mutilating young children and thinking this will, quote unquote, fix everything. These are kids who have traumas and multiple mental health issues who need real help, not hormones and puberty blockers. They also need to be taught to love their bodies and to take care of themselves. All of these kids are cutting and self-harming. Their discomfort, trauma, and self-hatred is so strong. I could go on, but I really wanted to thank you. And she just goes on to note and says, my daughter just graduated from medical school. She was taught and 100% believes that failure to affirm and give puberty blockers will contribute towards suicide. If I say otherwise, for example, I'll say, I counsel these kids in facilities, and I can tell you that transitioning in hormones don't seem to help at all. They're not any happier. They're still cutting and suicidal, etc. She acts like I just haven't learned and been stuck in the past. Honestly, it's probably career suicide for her to take the other view anyway. She's a young resident, and any other view is unacceptable in the current climate. I do have hope that the tide will start to turn as soon as more of us speak up. The next one is also on transition from Moose. It's a great podcast, very thought-provoking. I felt compelled to write in and share my thoughts on the topic. First, I've provided patients with hormone therapy to help start them on their transition. For some people, a little estrogen or a little testosterone is a world of difference. They come in very depressed, and by the next visit, they look happy, like a fog has been lifted. Another observation, and purely anecdotal, I know no research supporting this, but some women prefer being on hormonal birth control because it really helps their mental state. They say they feel, quote unquote, more themselves. There's something about hormones that influence the way we think and feel about ourselves and our place in the community around us, no doubt. I share the concern that making the option of transitioning more accessible has also opened the door to over-treating or providing treatment for people who probably don't need it. Some would be better served with perhaps some other interventions, such as counseling or mentorship. Anyway, just one person's thoughts. Thank you for doing what you do. Thank you both, Moose and Lori. It's just we just spent this whole past hour listening to Carole and just what a role hormones play in everything, let alone not just our behaviors, but our moods, our brains, our inclinations. So yes, I mean, as we heard from our guests on that program, a lot of these kids are struggling with depression or ADD, and they need treatment for that. But they're being diagnosed much too swiftly and self-diagnosing really that they're trans and being thrown onto these hormones in a alarming and distressing quickness. Debbie Debbie, before we get to the Nancy Jo comments, Debbie had one more comment on our trans series. She said, as a 70-year-old, I could not understand the recent last 5 years violence and anger at feminists and free speech in the name of trans women. I could not even find an entry point to the discussion, let alone answers to my many questions. Thanks to Danielle Crittenden for asking most of my questions in a most humane and mature way. Thank you. And to the two super articulate guests, Angus Fox and Corinne Cohn, who over and over identified the nuanced depths of the issue. Plus, as the conversation exposes, these nuanced depths are intertwined with so many other realities of 21st century human life. You've given me much to ponder, and more importantly, you've provided a sane, respectful place from which to do that pondering. Thank you. That's a nice comment, Debbie. Okay, Lana. Hi, Lana. Always love hearing from you. We're going to start now the Nancy Jo reaction section of listener reaction. Yes, I got a podcast equipment with sound effects, so I think I'm about to become really annoying. Okay, Lana, she said, is Nancy familiar with Data, a Love Story by Amy Webb? It's a quantitative approach to online dating, although it predates Tinder. Webb tweaks her algorithmic approach and succeeds in finding a long-term relationship. I'm curious about how their approaches compare. I think Lana wrote this before actually Nancy Jo came on the program. But she continues, how people go about finding a mate has always been of anthropological interest to me. While digital dating seems like a way to reach more people, ultimately you end up in the too much choice paradox, whereby having too many choices meaning you can't make a decision. At the same time, going out to a bar and talking to whoever shows up doesn't seem like a much better strategy. In an era where church isn't a thing, most people don't have extended communities, and leaving the house seems entirely unnecessary. I think we've just forgotten how to make friends. But I think I've rediscovered the answer: special interest groups. If you're feeling lonely, take up running or jujitsu or chess. Join the local chapter and go to the meetings, the drinks after meetings, the competitions, and the drinks after competitions. Volunteer, invite others to volunteer, or just hang out. Most people are shy and hoping someone else will be friendly to them. Or is that just me? No, I think that's great advice, Lana. You're absolutely right that we, especially this past year in a pandemic, is spending too much time by ourselves alone. But one of the things I'm looking forward to seeing is whether, as this, post-pandemic party begins, we may see a lot more young people, just being joyous and being unafraid to approach people, not just in bars, but in the streets and parks. And let's hope so. Okay, Elizabeth wrote, okay, so I didn't read her book, but just giving you my hot take from the interview. 1, she is full of shame and is projecting hostility and intolerance onto any critique of her actions. She probably shouldn't have written a book about her experience because she is not willing to be critiqued personally. A memoir was the wrong decision for her on this. 2 things can't be true at the same time. She made repeated bad choices that compromised her integrity and her personal safety, and the system, i.e. the tech world, is out to commodify the loneliness and non-connection their technological advances and a pandemic have brought upon us. 3, she's been spending too much time in online woke echo chambers. Love your podcast. Miranda was so much fun to listen to. Thanks, Elizabeth. Miranda, of course, is my eldest daughter, who was up top of that program to give some perspective from a millennial's viewpoint about using these apps. All right, the next one is from Art. It says, Danielle, no, it was not you. Nancy Jo Sales was a hypersensitive mess in your interview. Sales portrayed herself as a victim of the app Tinder, which is a dumpster fire, rather than admitting she did nothing to pick age-appropriate matches and seek to develop mature relationships. No, the inbuilt misogyny of the app somehow made her bang all the young dudes she met through Tinder. It's a little laughing emoji. If you get to 50, my age as well, and don't know you're going to have a problem building a lasting relationship with a 22-year-old, how are you even calling yourself an adult woman? This is not my first exposure to Sales, by the way. I'm a writer. I contacted her about her book, American Girls, which was useful in that it described the pathological relationship teen girls can have with social media. There is a thread running through her book describing her Tinder experiences and American girls as well. She attributes a total lack of agency of women. Social media is bad, not because it leads to teen girls bullying other teen girls, but because somehow girls choosing to post salacious pics to accumulate Instagram likes is a manifestation of misogyny. In a way, as with the Tinder book, Sales never quite explains. Okay, this is from Michael. Hey, Danielle. Wow, this woman is deranged. I'm 41 now and have been using dating apps pretty much since they came out. When I was in my early to mid 20s, I was quite fond of women 15 to 20 years older than me and had many wonderful experiences. Michael, you devil. That said, never did it ever cross my mind to make any of them a monogamous girlfriend. They knew what I wanted, and I knew they wanted it too. If this woman genuinely thinks at damn near 50 with children, some young man in the prime of his sexual life is going to settle down with her with all of the seemingly complex foibles and requirements she has, if I may be so bold, out of her goddamn mind. All right. Harsh, Michael, harsh, but true. Warren, definitely Nancy Jo was the crazy one. People often conflate their own mistakes with bias in the system. Nancy talked about herself as being helplessly, quote unquote, sucked into the inferno, when in fact, she was fanning the flames. It didn't turn out how she wanted, but instead of taking responsibility for her own outcomes, she pushed that responsibility to the app. Nancy is right that the app is biased toward the bad outcome she experienced, but she was also deeply complicit in creating that failure. This is from a young male listener who I think would very much be in the market for a femsplainer dating app. He says, this may be gauche, but I have to take every shot I can. I will be in New York City this fall. If your older daughter is still looking for dates at that time, I would love to take her out. I'm 33, I have a job, and I have a great relationship with my mom, who I don't live with. I was struck by the self-awareness Miranda demonstrated when she noted there was bad mouthing on both sides of the gender divide. That kind of charity is as refreshing as it is rare. All right, well, I'll forward your email to Miranda. I can't promise anything. Of course, she doesn't listen to her mom very often. So, Elizabeth, hey, Danielle, I normally never write emails to podcast hosts, but I had to after hearing your latest episode with Nancy Jo. To answer your question, she seemed crazy. I am a 36-year-old mother of two married to the same man for 10 years. My early teens and 20s had lots of sex that wasn't always things I wanted to do, but totally participated in willingly because I had such a lack of self-confidence and respect and just knowledge about intimacy and what relationships are really about. When I got older, I cringe at some of the shit I did and put up with, but I recognized my part in it. I found Nancy Jo lacking so much self-awareness, and she's how old? It was staggering. She took no responsibility for her actions and seemed to be blaming everything under the sink, capitalism, on her horrible experiences. Danielle, that was the strangest interview I've ever heard, and it had nothing to do with you. I just had to write and tell you that. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I appreciate that. This is from Sam. I laughed all the way through this interview as it started to circle the drain. I shared your incredulity. Your guest somehow missed the whole thing. As a guy, right about the certain age we share, I couldn't help but conclude Nancy Jo simply lives in a different universe. I think of my universe as the real world. Hers seems to be that agitated state of social media recursion where each self-reference begets another in a self-referential doom loop. I had to look up what clapback meant, which apparently is some form of escape condition in the doom loop. Somewhere about 10 levels into the recursion, she concluded you were slut shaming. From my vantage point, you were maybe slut observing, or perhaps even slut double taking. I conclude she was rather slut conscious, bordering on slut defensive. Okay, that's pretty funny, Sam. Rachel. Well, I can't speak to dating apps since I'm a rare millennial that married in my early 20s. I've witnessed the travails of countless friends as they've navigated the many apps. My question for all of them as they talk about the pointlessness of it is how it's made men less charming, made them feel like livestock, etc. Is why participate? Isn't it simple economics? Take away the supply of humans on the apps and demand will eventually follow. And she notes, though, I actually dropped my econ minors, so maybe that's not a great analogy. But the blanket refusal is always followed by, but what if I miss out on the one good person on there? Maybe it's FOMO mixed with addiction, but there is something very sad about it all. Okay, keep up the good work. All right, thank you. Very wise, Rachel, and congrats to you for escaping the whole dating app inferno. Olaf from Sweden. Hello, Sweden. I listened to your latest episode while out jogging. Very entertaining. Had a constant big smile and occasional laughs at how bizarre that interview turned out. You were not crazy, of course. Nancy Jo's sales seemed very obnoxious, very easily offended, complaining about you interrupting her, which you didn't, and saying that she deserved to be treated differently because she'd been to Yale, written award-winning books, etc. It all turned out to be one very entertaining episode. Well, Olaf, I'm glad that helped you along on your jogging and entertained you. Just a couple more, because all of you had some interesting angle to add. So, Joni, wow, accusing you of insults? Wow. I finished this episode a few minutes ago, and she is the one clutching pearls. Your question was not slut shaming. You may say you want this, you do this, results suck. Why do you keep doing the same thing? I surmise she's never been asked pointed questions before. Honestly, it's women like her who cannot own their contradictory message that give women a bad name. Oh yeah, I love me some meaningless sex. Why aren't you the person who wants to know more about me? LOL. This is actually really interesting. Joni says, I own a small coal trucking business and work only with men. When they talk about some of their crazy exes, yeah, I get that. She'd be one of them. All right, Denise. My personal experience with dating apps or websites goes back 20 years. I spent from 2001 to about 2004 meeting men online, looking for companionship, sex, and a lasting relationship. I am a heterosexual biological woman. I met many men online, many IRL. I had sex with many as well. I made one long-term friend, but didn't find a lasting relationship. Oh, this is such a good story. Yeah, she goes on to say, I did find it exhausting and degrading after a few years and decided to quit. I was very happily alone till 2016 when I was visiting a sick friend who was in the hospital in London. A buddy of mine suggested that I use Tinder to find someone to go to a museum with or just have coffee in a park as a way to occupy my time between visits to the hospital. I did give it a try and met the one and only person who seemed nice and was willing to take my preference into account. I never expected to find someone to have a relationship with. I was an American in the UK. A cross-Atlantic connection did not seem workable, but it did work. We've been together for over 5 years now, very, very happily. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Great story. All right, Sam. Oh, Sam has a criticism for my daughter, Miranda. He says, I think fancy restaurants are a bad idea for a first date, especially with someone you don't know for many reasons. That said, if you're a young woman and a guy thinks enough of you to take you on a first date to a restaurant that serves branzino, you should be thrilled, and choking on a fishbone might not be sexy, but it's not a character defect. He was responding to Miranda's anecdote about a recent date that hadn't gone well, not least because I don't think he was choking on the fishbone, Sam, but he just kind of like a cat spat up a piece of the branzino and, just without saying anything, left it there on the plate. But what I tell my children about dating, which goes to a little bit what you're saying, is there are things you can fix and there are things you can't. So if you don't like how he dresses or you don't like his haircut, or, these are all superficial things. And right, maybe his table manners aren't the best. Those can be fixed. But there are other things as character defects that you can't fix. And one should always be aware of the differences of those things. Okay, a couple more. I keep saying that, but they're good. I'm 56, and this is from Rhonda. I'm 56. I certainly had casual sex in my younger and not so younger days, and I ultimately found it disheartening. But if I were to discourage a younger woman from frequent casual sex, I would probably be accused of slut shaming and misogyny and probably being a TERF, a Karen, and who knows what else. But my intention would not have been to shame her or contain her in some outdated definition of womanhood, but to encourage her to seek more fulfilling relationships. I feel like so many young women are caught in what they are told, what they are supposed to be and expect, and the reality of human relationships, which may be based in misogyny, fair point, but you're still operating in that framework. So can you really expect radically different outcomes? Well, we heard from Carole just about how embedded those differences in approaches are. Okay, so the second last one is from John. For the record, I met my second and current wife on a dating app, and we've been happily married for almost 10 years now. I'm not sure it's my misogyny that keeps us together, but we also didn't note that we were hooking up for casual sex in our profiles either. Yeah, pro tip, John. Thank you. All right, this last one is from Becky. And Becky has written a short one-act play on this episode. And I'm going to read it to you as a short one-act play. So she said, so here's the background. A woman wants to get a dog. She wants companionship, a pup she can snuggle with and care for. She's seen online videos of border collies leaping for frisbees and think that looks great. That reminds her of being young and energetic. She decides to write a book about her experiences with a new border collie pup. Long story short, the woman gets the pup. She takes it out for walks and adventures playing fetch. She finds it thrilling. But the woman lives in a small apartment. The dog gets bored and increasingly destructive. She writes about finding the experience on the whole to be disheartening and disappointing. A couple of years later, the woman is interviewed on a podcast. Interviewer: welcome to the podcast. Woman: whoa, that was judgy. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be. Let's talk about your book. You decided to get a border collie. They're known to be highly energetic. You knew that going in, right? Are you calling me old? I don't appreciate being age shamed. Oh, that wasn't my intent. I mean, we're essentially the same age. Anyway, I cringed when I read about the dog chewing furniture and carpeting day after day. And oh, how that was difficult to deal with. Day after day, day after day. Where did you get that? Oh, in your book, you write about replacing rugs and drywall in nearly every chapter. I don't know what you're talking about. Can you send me an example? Well, I'd be happy to do that. So with the high energy, these types of dogs need training. Did you consult a dog trainer? Again, with your age shaming. The woman dog trainer I consulted called me old. I filed a complaint with her employer. Oh dear. Border collies are also known to be highly intelligent. That means they can easily get bored. Are you calling me stupid? No, I think you'd understand my story better if you would just listen. Okay, go ahead. I wish you'd stop interrupting me. I went to Yale and Columbia. This interview is over. All right, Becky, maybe best listener reaction ever. Thank you for writing that. Thank you all for your great comments. Thank you all for being listeners. A special shout out to our subscribers at patreon.com/femsplainers. We'll be back in early September, again, with a new network, Podcast One. Have a lovely summer, everyone. So appreciate having you as our listeners and look forward to a very exciting new season. Thanks and goodbye. See you in September. The Femsplainers is a weekly podcast carried on the Ricochet Network and available pretty much on every podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and watch video of our interviews on YouTube. You'll find links to everything, plus how to contact us directly at femsplainers.com. We survive and depend on your support. Like the show? Consider donating as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/femsplainers. And get our exclusive monthly bonus episode, Last Call, in which you get to join the conversation with our guests. And there's much more. And a big shout out of thanks to our audio and video editor, Nat Frum.